Morning or whatever time it is when you are listening to us here at Taking Liberties. We are talking news and views on what is happening this week in the world of freedom. I'm Lara, and
I'm
I'm
Austin.
joined today by a number of my friends.
Still Austin.
Uh, Vikas.
Kieran.
Joining us from Canberra. So to start us off today, something that I wanted to talk a bit about was the Food Stars Labelling Scheme website, which has been taken down, is causing consternation in some circles. Something that the last government, the Gillard government, brought in was a system of labelling foods out of 5 stars to rate their overall healthiness. It was the result of a push of a number of public health lobby groups trying to make it easier for consumers to make health decisions about what it is they eat. Now, one thing that came as part of this policy was a website, which was going to be used to compare foods in certain categories so consumers could see what the ratings were as the system's being developed. But the site has been taken down by the current government. So apparently this is coming from the minister's office. Apparently there's evidence it's coming from the minister's office, and a lot of people are very concerned because state governments say that the site was up and ready and everything was fine. But the minister's office is telling us that it was just a draft or an early version that was not supposed to be released for public consumption. So it's all very interesting. It looks like the government might be changing its mind on whether to pursue this policy. And personally, I think that's actually quite a good thing. I'm not a big fan of companies being told what to put on their packaging. To this particular extent, I think it's a bit weird for the government to decide what is and what is not healthy and then make it so basically available as though people can't read the back of the packet that tells you what's in it. Which again is another regulation that that packaging has to tell all consumers what the ingredients are. But at least at that point, it's not making a judgment for you. I don't know. What do you guys think?
So I think that I agree that the idea that you provide consumers with more information and allow them to make their own choices is sort of intuitively appealing to me, and that jives for me with this basic idea that as a consumer you shouldn't be misrepresented. Like, if you buy a box of cereal, it should contain cereal and it should contain what you think it's going to contain. And so I'm a strong supporter of sort of the standard nutritional labeling stuff. Where I think it gets onto dicier ground is making the value call. So we all know there's a bunch of different views on what's healthy, whether you want to go on paleo or Atkins or high carb, low carb, all of these different things, avoid refined carbs, eat complex
Personally,
carbs.
I eat everything deep fried.
Yeah, or the Austen deep fried diet. Those, I think, for the moment at least, the science is not clear enough for us to say definitively this diet is better than that diet. And so I think there's a subjective value call which happens there. And when you set up a system where you say companies have to put a star rating on their product, which may come from a government body who's calculating it using a different method to the one the company thinks and a different method to what their customers think, I think they're ending up providing what they would think and what their customers would think is misleading information. And that's sort of my happiness that this is going away.
Look, my favorite part about this entire thing was that water came up as being a 0-star item on this list, purely because it has no calories and no other nutritional value.
Produced in unregulated conditions.
And that too. So for me, the perspective is essentially, it's like any other government standard, right? Does it actually meet the needs of who's actually going to use it? And then it also comes with the point that, is it overriding an existing industry standard? And I think that the industry has an incentive to put out the information about what's good about its food. I think essentially the government was trying to solve a problem that didn't actually exist, and basically ended up bungling it as a result.
Well, if we look at the rates of obesity in society, we can conclude that some people seem to have a difficult time making decisions about what to eat and what not to eat.
Look, nobody is eating like 5 McDoubles a day and thinking that they're getting a healthy diet. They eat it because it's delicious. And I think that's the thing, is that people know what's healthy food and what's not, largely. That you don't think a stalk of celery is unhealthy, you don't think a Tim Tam is healthy, but you pick the Tim Tam because it's delicious.
Interestingly enough, so there's also a perception issue here. For example, like a lot of people I've seen eat like handfuls and handfuls of trail mix, right? And trail mix, you can consume as much as 300 calories and about 15, 16 grams of sugar in one handful. And most people think it's healthy because it's got nuts and fruit. Another example is preserved fruits. Those dried apricots and shit. Those things have so much sugar and so much, like basic preservatives that they're not that healthy for you, and you should have
that's
at
the point
most.
of trail mix, right? It's supposed to be a high-calorie, easy, like low-volume thing. Like you're supposed to be taking it with you when you're walking and burning thousands of calories a day. You're not supposed to be eating it when you're sitting on your couch watching Oprah reruns or something.
Totally agree with you, but like,
does Oprah have reruns?
Yeah, but that's a good question, but not relevant. But that just comes back. But that just comes back to the idea of perception of what is healthy and what is not, and why labeling might be important. But like I said, it's not. It doesn't necessarily fall on the government to do that labeling. I'm saying there is an invested interest in industry to get the most accurate information out about their food, because if they're not, I mean, there's no shortage of food producers.
So I think I'd pick up on what Austen was saying, though, that people choose what they eat. Like, I think there's a really pernicious and dangerous idea that you see in a lot of progressive discourse in Australia, that people are somehow not responsible for their choice. That when you walk down the supermarket aisle and you look at, it's a strange aisle, I'll give you that, but you look at the celery stick and the Tim Tam and you go, you're somehow forced by advertising to pick up the Tim Tam. I think that...
Plain package that shit, bro.
Yeah. That's an argument that leads you down to plain packaging, it leads you down to all of these regulations, it leads you down to banning things, because you start with this idea that people are incapable of making their own choice.
And the whole presumption of the star system. The whole presumption of the star system is that there's one axis of value that everyone applies to their eating habits. That healthy eating is what we all value and what we want, and the stars recognize that as the supreme sort of standard of value. And the fact is, nobody eats that way. You don't drink 20 beers in a night because you're worried about the health value. That's just not how people operate.
So I think one of the ways to think about this, like subjective values, is the other subjective value of food is taste. Like, imagine if the government introduced a system where everyone just had to put on a star rating of how good their food tasted. Just
there'd be a whole lot of 5 stars.
Exactly. Do I get 5 smiles or do I get 1 frowny face on this product? It's an inherently subjective choice.
Yeah, but but it's not as if those things haven't been done, right? It's the thing, like, I think I'm having a slightly different argument in the sense that I'm saying it is possible to measure these things in the sense that, because, newspapers have, culinary critiques.
Sure.
Right? Which is entirely a subjective taste. Where I come to objection with it is basically the fact that there is a government mandating that this has to be done, and there's the beauty of the beauty of subjective taste is that everybody has one, and we can choose who has the most equivalent taste towards us. But the idea of the government creating a absolute, this is like an objective standard for taste or an objective standard for what is healthy. That's the real issue. That's where it falls apart.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right about that. I mean, if you look at organic certification, for example, that evolved organically through private industry, and there's no reason that health rankings, etc., couldn't do so privately. But I think in this particular case with the star rating system, probably a big part of the reason that it hasn't happened, that it hasn't sort of developed itself privately, is that it doesn't actually provide you with information. You ask any dietitian or nutritionist what it is you need to do to make sure that your diet is healthy. And the number one thing they're going to tell you is that it doesn't. It is a question of balance. You have to be making sort of long-term decisions about what it is that you consume, but it's okay to have an entire packet of Tim Tams in a day as long as you're not doing that every day or with every other kind of food that's hydrated in, well, not hydrated, but completely saturated with fat or sugar. As long as you are taking these things in balance, it's fine, which is why it really doesn't make sense to me that this is the kind of scale they've used, and I'm fairly happy to see that it looks like it might not be coming out.
I will say, though, if it does go ahead, I'm going to be having a 1-star party night where every item is 1 star or below, because that sounds like a lot of fun.
There's a lot of room.
Yeah, I've just realized it would also be really cheap because you could just, pour a ton of tap water.
I think one of the other pieces here is that it's, like someone mentioned earlier, it's a solution begging for a problem. Like, Tim Tams are not on the store in the shelf being advertised as health food. There's a health food section, and it's full of healthy things. And there's a not health food section, which is where Austen shops, and he buys his packet of Tim Tams, and then he smashes them all at, like, before midday on a Saturday, because that's how he rolls. But no one has told Austen that those are healthy. He isn't eating them under the illusion that those are a healthy choice. And
it's just like yesterday at the Multicultural Festival. I mean, you know those hot dogs aren't necessarily healthy, but you still go for them.
Yeah.
It's racist if you don't.
So maybe moving on to some other topic from the news.
Yeah, absolutely. Vikas has found a really interesting story about copyright law in Australia. Vikas?
Okay, so today is literally 74 years. My bad. I was about to say 10 years.
So yesterday.
Was it yesterday? Oh, wait, hang on. Oh yeah. Actually, yeah, it is yesterday. Sorry. I am really bad at dates, aren't I? So 74 years ago, yesterday, was when Disney released Pinocchio. Now, interestingly enough, to everybody out there, Pinocchio is still under copyright. So you can't, like, replicate, I guess, the intellectual property in there. Like, you can't make a Pinocchio doll without exclusively licensing it from Disney.
So just to add there, the Pinocchio story, the original, like the folk tale, is
that's a Brothers Grimm story. It's public domain.
But anything which Disney did with the story is still under copyright.
Yeah, so it's kind of like the color purple and the red Santa. Sorry, I should have explained that better. But the thing is, a lot of intellectual property debate revolves around patent laws. Now, mainly because of Monsanto, but like people don't realize the more inherent issues with copyright in the sense that we essentially have rent-seeking organizations that increase the period of time, which was traditionally 25 years, basically to maintain their licensability for trademarked, commercial merchandise. Yeah. So commercial merchandise. Now, the issue is, while this law was essentially brought in to protect intellectual property owners, we've, as a result of this rent-seeking group, had an issue where you could get more books that were produced during the period of Grover Cleveland than under Ronald Reagan, just because they've managed to restrict the replication of intellectual property art. Now, the question is, like, intellectual property, we can have a debate about that, but, like, is it morally right that something should be extended indefinitely to prevent anyone else from reproducing that particular merchandise, I guess you could say?
I think I'd jump in there with a pretty controversial no. It's not morally correct. I think that there's a very easy, very logical argument for some kind of copyright. If Disney is going to make a Pinocchio movie in 1940, then they want to. The reason that they make that movie is they want to make some money, and their ability to make money on that work is pretty directly impacted if 2 days later or a week later someone brings out a copy. And so I think that there's a sound argument for some protection. But anyone who thinks that Disney would not have produced Pinocchio in 1940 because they were worried that they wouldn't still be making money from it in 2014 is insane. Like, we could easily strip away, 50 years of that copyright protection, and the original work would have still been produced, people would have still loved it, and there would be more opportunity for other works to expand on it, change it, and there's a cultural aspect there that when we apply copyright in this way, we limit sort of, call it cultural innovation.
Actually, yeah, and I actually think the best example of that is many people might have seen the works of, you've all seen a Shakespearean play, and we've all seen individual interpretations of Shakespeare's play.
I think you overestimate my culture.
Sorry, Austen. I didn't realize you grew under a rock. But
did they not have the internet in New York?
Yeah, but I mean, what's the best example? 10 Things I Hate About You. What was that? The Taming of the Shrew?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's, Heath Ledger, fantastic, right? So we Lara swoon. But
all right.
we got some really, really great movies coming out of some, basically adaptations of Shakespeare.
Well, look at Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, Sherlock Holmes.
How many adaptations are there currently? And they're all pretty phenomenal. Like Robert Downey Jr. version, the Benedict Cumberbatch version, they're all great. And we wouldn't have any of that if it was
actually.
Still on the
So Ian Fleming. I wouldn't have thought of that either.
Ian Fleming's James Bond.
Oh crap! Arthur Conan Doyle.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Now
the other British guy who writes.
Apparently my English lit is pretty bad. Which is ironic since I'm talking about copyright.
C.S. Lewis, the guy who did Lord of the Rings, right?
Exactly. But the point
Somewhere
is,
thousands of nerds are crying.
Yeah, but the point is we've been starved of really great reboots, or even potentially way better than the original reboots, like with Sherlock Holmes, as Robert Downey Jr. played him. So I guess. Does anybody else have any strong feelings on this?
Yeah, I am actually a big fan of intellectual property. I'm surprised to find myself to be probably the only person on this side of the fence in this discussion. And I think, there can be an argument made that, if you're writing a novel, if you reproduce a novel that somebody else wrote, are you attacking their property, or are you rearranging your own property so that it looks the same? And that, there's an argument to be made. But the point that, well, we might have more things if there weren't copyright restrictions, I think sounds very selfish and very childish, to be honest. Like, oh, wouldn't it be awesome if I could just have Pinocchio if this other person didn't own it? I think that when you create something, you have the right to say when you create something, you have, to an extent, the right to protect it. It is your property. I see a very, very strong link, strong conceptual link, at least, between intellectual property and physical property. And so I'm quite happy to see a system of patents effectively the way that it operates. I mean, Sherlock might be an outstanding story, but to say that, that copyright has prevented reboots is certainly fair, but a copyright on Sherlock Holmes doesn't prevent any other detective story. There is you can still create similar things in many cases.
We're playing with a lot of counterfactuals here, aren't we? Because if you look at Star Wars, that would have been a Flash Gordon reboot if he had been allowed to use the rights, if Lucas had been allowed to use the rights, and that would have been a tragedy. But we also would have been saved the prequels, so it's a little hard to say which was actually the best story. So I really don't know.
That's totally fair. I suppose there are 2 points I always want to make when it comes to intellectual property, and the first one is WD-40 has never been patented. So WD-40 is not something I use in my life very much because I am not a handy kind of girl, but I understand spray it on things and it makes them work. And that's never been patented because if you were to patent it, you have to disclose what it is composed of, and by choosing not to patent it, they've been able to actually keep its formula a secret, which is really valuable for them. So in that way, there are benefits to not patenting. There are obvious sort of broader utility benefits to not patenting things like sea containers, shipping containers. I think are one of the obvious ones where it's really valuable to have international uniformity. So it's what do you call it? The costs of doing business have been greatly reduced by every company being able to use exactly the same shipping container. But the flip side to that is pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals, absolute favorite argument in favor of intellectual property, because you're dealing with an industry that really gets to the extremes of the issues, which is that what it produces has a very, very high utility. Like, we are talking drugs that can save lives, that can treat conditions that have previously been untreatable, and that can just make your life better or your erection last longer. And, these things are very, very valuable. Well, they can't do it for me, but hopefully the time will come. And it will only come if they're able to have patents, because it takes about $2 billion of research and development to get a drug to FDA.
That's the problem right there. That's what you said. It's the regulatory burden on these companies that are designing it.
That's not the regulatory burden. That's how much it costs to develop the drug. And then you get it to the FDA, which certainly adds to the cost. There's no denying that that's the case, but that's a separate cost entirely. So the cost of actually producing it is huge, or the cost of inventing it is huge. And so in order to sort of maintain the capital to continue making those investments, it stands to reason that when you put $2 billion into something, someone shouldn't be able to come in 2 days later, rip it off, which is much easier than coming up with it in the first place and then profit from it.
Okay, what I was asking...
How come I can still buy Bayer aspirin as well as the name brand? Surely that there is some value to name recognition and the first mover advantage that you're completely discounting by saying that these cheap knockoff brands are going to go displace the market.
As I said, it's at the extreme. It's the value of it.
Sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
Can I actually... Yeah, so first mover advantage doesn't so much apply in patent laws, in particular with medical stuff, because you're essentially saying each medical research facility would actually have to have its own research labs duplicating research. That is actually one of the biggest arguments made for medical patenting, in the sense that because patents require you to completely disclose what you're patenting, it actually gives everybody an idea exactly what's been produced, and actually reduces laboratory duplication of research. The effect of that is also, after the monopoly period, you get a whole bunch of generic drug makers, which obviously comes in, after the first mover advantage is long since gone. Now you can make the argument that for 25 years people are getting ripped off. And really, you could bring that down to about 20 years if you got rid of all the FDA restrictions and everything like that. But at the same time, I'd argue that the simple cost that everybody is not duplicating work is far exceeding the potential rip-off factor of everybody in the market.
What I'd jump in on, though, to sort of rebut the first mover comment. So I'm also a reasonably robust defender of intellectual property, and
you're all communists.
We are all communists.
Property is best.
And the point I would make is that if Company A spends $2 billion developing a drug, and then Company B makes a knockoff the next day, they then have to, the market, competition, etc., they'll end up selling those products likely at a similar cost. Company A, who did the research, has spent $2 billion. Company B, who made the knockoff, they've just spent the same amount on manufacturing as Company A. So research is penalized in that situation. And I think innovation would stagnate without intellectual property. The one that I would like to sort of push Lara on, though, is how long something should be protected. So to bring it back to Pinocchio, that's still protected 24 years later.
Yep.
Or if you want to look at pharmaceuticals, I'm not sure.
It's 25 years.
25 years, because it's saying. So I think there's a question of that period, and my feeling is that you have to put some reasonable upper limit on that.
Yeah.
What are you thinking, Lara?
I don't know that you necessarily have to. I mean, that's sort of where utilitarianism comes in, and I try not to tend towards that kind of thinking. So I probably don't have a hard and fast answer for that. My sort of first thought, and I haven't developed this too well, so it might be a bit harebrained, is until profit is commensurate to input. Until they've been able to recoup the costs of developing whatever the product is.
Well, for something like copyright, when you're selling like copies of a work, I think it makes sense to do a proportion of initial sales. So if the sale of Pinocchio DVDs or whatever drops to 10% of its original, say, first-year sale period, at this point you're no longer talking about first-mover advantage. I don't think that there's any reason to continue protection after that. Now, there's obviously assessment costs with that, and there could be some efficiency arguments made there, but at the very least, it's a sensible metric that if you sell 10 million copies in year one, and 5 years later you're selling 1 million copies a year, I don't think we necessarily need the intellectual property protection anymore.
Yeah. So on a different tack, Austen, you're saying that you read an interesting article about the ABC earlier this week.
I've read several. It seems to be a recent push, with Mr. Abbott's recent comments about the ABC being on the side of everyone except Australia. And I think that really, I don't agree with all the criticism leveled against it. I'm not sure how biased it really is. But the fact is that there's a growing sort of recognition that something needs to be done. We've got 2 national broadcasters, which is, in my opinion, 2 more than any country needs, not to mention all the radio stations, internet stuff. It seems a little bit much. We're spending, I think, $1 billion a year on supporting our national broadcasters, and it's hard to see that that's still serving the purpose that it originally was intended to serve, which is, of course, bringing information to areas, bringing news to areas that wouldn't otherwise be serviced by the market. And in a world where you could have news sites from around the world at your fingertips, it seems a little redundant that we still have to worry about a national broadcasting corporation.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think that the argument ends up being, people watch the ABC. I think achieves the 3rd highest market share in metro areas. It's not an unpopular service, but when you dig into the demographics of who it's popular with, you're looking at upper middle class professionals who are enjoying what is, I would say, high quality TV content. They're getting a good TV service, they're getting it in their metro areas, and then getting it without any advertisements. So what we're seeing here is actually a transfer of, sort of call it time, from people out in, say, Western Sydney who might be watching Channel 7 or Channel 9 and having advertisements and commercials, and they're paying taxes which are then going to fund the ABC and SBS so that people in nicer parts of the city with better paying jobs can enjoy better quality programming without having to watch any ads. It's effectively a regressive income transfer.
Just to clarify what we're talking about here as well, I've just got a source that tells us that collectively the ABC and SBS operate 7 television channels, 7 national radio stations, 15 digital radio stations, more than 50 local radio stations, 2 international broadcasters, 2 catch-up platforms, and 2 news and current affairs websites. That is
a partridge in a pear tree.
Pardon?
And a partridge in a pear tree. It's excessive. It's excessive. It truly is.
All up, it's over $1 billion of taxpayer money goes in there, and I think you might be able to make an argument for some part of that, for perhaps rural radio.
Absolutely, I think
Emergency
a lot
broadcasting.
of country radio is quite important. When it comes to dismantling the ABC, I'm pretty happy to see it staggered And that would be one of the things I would want to see go last, because
I,
Australia is a highly urbanised society, and we tend to forget about our agricultural brethren in the bush. But it's not easy out there. The service provision is absolutely terrible. And that's one of the gaps that it's useful to have the ABC filling. I don't think it's the only solution, but it is the simplest one from the position that we're in. But as Kieran says, given the demographics of people who watch the ABC, there's no reason to have the entire monolith publicly funded. And for me, the monolith really is the biggest issue of it, because it is so huge and because it is able to promote its content without advertising because it has government funding. It's crowding out the media market, and because of the internet and the digital revolution, a lot of the other stations are in a state of flux. We all know Channel 10 and Fairfax have been having a lot of problems lately, and everyone has to update and revise their formats so that they can work out what the market is trying to tell them about what people are demanding. And it's frankly distortionary to have, you know, an online news service that can afford to give its news out for free when, you know, News Limited's going behind a paywall in order to stay in business.
Yeah. And look, I think probably all of us here are in agreement that at least some of the ABC and SBS services should be privatized. And I think that raises an interesting question: is what is the best way to do that? What's the fairest way to do that? And I think the general things that are recommended are, firstly, is just to sell it off and use the funds to pay off the debt, reduce the deficit, and so on. And then more creative proposals involve giving shares to Australians, giving shares to the stakeholders. I think that's probably a more fair way to go. The question is, how should they be distributed? And I think that it's possible that we ought to consider giving shares to anyone who, say, paid taxes in the last year. They all get a share. And then let the market decide from there what's done with it.
yeah, I can imagine a few ways that'd go wrong.
I think
Yeah?
before any kind of privatization, you'd need to. I think it would be best for it to be in government hands while it was transitioned to a commercially viable model. So you would want to, I think, see it leave government. At the moment, it's not commercially viable. You know, they don't their income is from the government. They don't have any significant income streams.
It's a bit like Holden.
Operation. So at the moment, if you gave away those shares out to every Australian, you said, or every taxpayer, they'd then be sitting on
a crap of infrastructure that they really
not necessarily a particularly high value share. I think there's an argument maybe that you move it to a commercial footing before giving it out. I would. My inclination for sort of simplicity and everything would be to give a share to all citizens and not worry about whether or not they've paid net tax and all of the complexities which go around with working that out. I think keep it simple, maybe give, you might split the company 50-50 and say 50% of the shares are going out in a public offering and 50% will be allocated out to citizens. Yeah. And then if friends of the ABC want to put their money where their mouth is and buy up shares, then they can. If they're not prepared to pay for content, then why should we have it?
Well, Kieran, my worry about the idea of making it commercially profitable first is that you create a perverse incentive structure. Is that if you're working for the ABC and you know that once you're making a profit, you get privatized and you lose your government revenue stream, your incentives are to remain unprofitable as long as possible.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I hadn't actually thought of that.
Sorry, my favorite part about this entire thing is essentially the people that support the ABC the most are the ones losing their media diversity the most. So, obviously their market is, urban professionals earning fairly good incomes, and they tend the inner city areas tend to be, left-leaning. So, and if you take a look at it, the left-leaning, I mean, how many media sources does the left really have in Australia? I mean, you've got Fairfax that's dying. The Guardian's popped up now, but it's only really dominating a very small niche left market. But like, there's space for the right, in the sense that you've got what is it, News Limited?
Yeah.
Right. And you know, like, the ABC's very, 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 very wary of their actual institutional bias there, in the sense that they'll frequently actually make the effort of contacting the CIS. They'll frequently make the effort of contacting the IPA, not for any other reason than to appear to be balanced. So from their perspective, you know, from the perspective of who this actually affects, it's just interesting to see that the people that are probably affected the most by the crowding out effect of the ABC are the ones that are wanting to keep it around the most.
So I think I'd disagree probably with arguments about the ABC being as systemically biased as people say.
Yeah, me too.
We'll put that aside. I think that you raise a really interesting point that the
ABC is killing media diversity.
Yeah, if you draw the Venn diagram of, you know, people who care about and want the ABC to continue, and then you draw the circle for people who are upset that Fairfax is folding, and then you draw the circle for people who like reading The Conversation, you start seeing this giant overlap where you have these quite well-off people who are going on reading content and viewing content through the ABC, through The Conversation, through other government-funded organisations. And meanwhile, they're avoiding things like Fairfax because Fairfax has to put up ads, and they have
and the Guardian too. I mean,
and
the
Guardian.
Yeah.
So the Guardian's a free one as well, but that's philanthropy.
Yeah.
But you have these venerable companies like Fairfax who are being very much crowded out of the market. And I think what people miss there is that there's a self-fulfilling prophecy at work, that people look at and go, we can't get rid of the ABC, because if we get rid of the ABC, then all that's left as progressive voices or objective voices, whatever you want to call it, is Fairfax, which is dying, or Crikey, which is a niche player. But what people miss is that the ABC, by its very existence, crowds out these other voices. I think it was about 13 or 15% of people who are watching one of the ABC channels every night in metro area. That's 13, 15% of people who are not watching any hypothetical commercial channel offering the same content.
Sure.
You know, like if you're Channel 10, why would you go head to head with the ABC? Why would Channel 10 run a show like Four Corners when the ABC will run the same show with no ads?
Yeah.
And that's a very direct crowd out, and people go, oh, if we get rid of the ABC, then it's just going to be Today, Tonight, and A Current Affair on TV. The only reason those are the shows and that and the 7 p.m. project, they're the shows that we get because ABC doesn't do that stuff.
Yeah.
The ABC hasn't crowded those market segments out.
Well, yeah, it's essentially like any other market distortion put forward by the government. Private industry will fill in the spaces of which government has not filled in.
Yeah, absolutely. But sort of as another change of tack, just recently in January, Treasury Department released the latest tax expenditures report.
Yep.
So this one's going to veer slightly wonkier.
Everyone get your calculators out. There's going to be some maths.
Pocket protectors.
I am a calculator.
Please don't do this to me.
We're libertarians.
Don't worry.
I've got a calculator. That joke will make no sense to anyone listening to the podcast. I'm sorry. I have a cat on my lap.
Yeah. It's the cat is better at maths than I am. So tax expenditures are when you have basically an exemption to tax. So if an easy example here is income tax. So we pay income tax, and then we go through the e-tax form, and we creatively think of deductions, and we put those in, and we go, yes, I've done this course or read this book, subscribed to this magazine.
It's not creative if it's accepted.
And I, as a result, will pay less income tax. So a tax expenditure is some method, deduction, exemption, loophole, whatever you want to call it, which allows a person or a company to pay less than the headline tax rate. So there was an IMF report which came out recently as well, which showed that Australia had the highest levels of tax expenditures across the OECD when measured against GDP. So up in the same kind of region with us was Italy, the USA, the UK, and then down at the other end you have countries like Korea, Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands. So the point there, I think, is that, and this is a controversial point within the libertarian movement, I view tax expenditures as morally equivalent to subsidies. If Vikas and I, for example, both pay 30% income tax.
Yeah, but we both pay more.
Vikas and I, for this example, Vikas and I earn the same amount of money, and we both pay the same amount of tax. We pay 30% tax, and then the government gives me $5,000. That's a subsidy.
Yeah, that's a direct subsidy.
And it doesn't give Vikas that money. I am relatively advantaged compared to Vikas, and I'm going to make different decisions because of that. Vikas is going to make different decisions because of that. And then the example for tax expenditure is that rather than the government giving me $5,000, they charge me, say, 28% income tax, and they charge Vikas 32% income tax.
Isn't that really an argument against progressive taxation, though?
It's quite separate to progressive taxation. You can consider it as like the ceteris paribus.
Okay.
That if you...
For anyone not
there it is, ceteris paribus. We're libertarians.
Yeah, ceteris paribus. All other things considered equal.
Yeah. So the point that I'd make is that one person's tax expenditure, the benefit that I gain from receiving a tax expenditure, is directly attributed to the loss that everyone else who doesn't have that tax expenditure incurs by paying a slightly higher rate. And it's exactly the same issues with subsidies, where you have concentrated benefits. I'm the one person who gets this, and a lot of tax expenditures go to very small segments, and then everyone else in the economy is impacted by a tiny amount.
So can you give us some quick examples?
So you get, in Australia, you get, for example, exemptions for GST, for education, health, financial supplies. You get a whole bunch of exemptions on the GST. GST makes up, what, 5, 6, a lot. My maths is that bad.
By the looks of it, it's about $38 billion.
Yeah. So that's not just GST. So you have these different exemptions. So maybe.
Oh, that is just GST.
So just having a look. So capital gains tax for the main residence exemption. That Treasury works out that at having $16.5 billion in foregone revenue. So that's $16.5 billion which comes from somewhere else, from someone else, or at the moment comes through debt. And so I think my perspective is that as the government of the day moves towards trying to balance the budget and address debt, what they should do is look at closing some of these tax expenditures simplifying the tax system and lowering the headline rate. You know, in my mind, it's better for us to have no deductions on our income tax, which is, you know, there's a few $1 billion in there, to have no deductions on our income tax and for us all to pay slightly less income tax. That kind of system is also less complex for us. You know, a giant chunk of the time that we spend filling out our tax returns is trying to find the tax exemptions for us. Get rid of that. Now filling out our tax return becomes a 5-minute activity, not a 5-hour activity, and we've paid slightly less headline tax, and we've received that benefit throughout the year rather than waiting at the end and getting what we think is a windfall in a tax return.
Intoxication.
But is actually just all of the money that we should have had over the last year with no interest.
Yeah. So, sorry, just to sort of jump in on this. I'm going to go all. Sorry, you know who I'm. You know, Kerry Packer here.
Yeah.
Look, I just don't believe the government deserves my money. That's
Yeah.
it. Full stop. But just to sort of come back to the point, this kind of just proves the level at which rent seeking occurs at all areas of our government. I mean, there isn't a single one of these expenditures that you can point to and tell me that there isn't a vested party that has argued for it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What I think I'd riff on your Kerry Packer example. So people should look up. We'll post a link to it somewhere. There's a famous YouTube clip of Kerry Packer at I think it was a Senate inquiry.
It was a Senate inquiry on why he paid $30 of tax.
Yeah. So I think
Patriot. Real patriot.
What we'd say there is that a complex tax system creates advantages to the most wealthy who can afford to pay for accountants and lawyers to go through and find all of these deductions and exemptions, and that's why you might see big businesses paying an effective company tax rate of 25%, whereas you might see small operators paying the headline rate of 30%. A complex system advantages incumbents, it advantages larger companies, and that's a common theme across sort of regulatory complexity generally.
There's also a really good example from the States where, was it GE? GE made crap tons of money from their defense and their green energy sector. Yeah. And basically, even after the bailout for their bumbling financial sector, they paid zero tax, and that was all as a result of all the various rent-seeking policies and exemptions they'd managed to get from the Obama administration. Now, obviously, this has a real effect, and it's market distorting in the favor of big business. But it's kind of one of these things that's really difficult to tackle, just because you're going to deal with very, very powerful vested interests to begin with.
That something's difficult doesn't mean it's not worth doing.
But it does mean it is less likely to get done. Yes.
So I think, and
as you can tell, it's taken 5 minutes to explain the actual issue. I mean, this is really what libertarianism is about. I mean, taking a really, really complex issue that people have tried to hide, and sort of bring it up.
I think maybe Austen might want to talk on this, but it's easy for me to say, yeah, we should reduce the complexity and reduce the rate, but I think there's the problem of what happens where you just reduce the complexity and you keep the same tax rate, and
which
so
is
you end up
which is always going to be the incentive of governments.
Which is surely what would happen. I mean, government has very weak incentive to reduce its own income voluntarily.
Yeah, look, to the extent we're going to have taxes, I think we definitely as libertarians want them to be as efficient and transparent as possible. But you get a ratchet effect here, that government introduces, strange subsidies and tax expenditures into the tax law, becomes more complicated. Then in the effort of making it more efficient, they remove those things and raise taxes. And then you introduce new subsidies, and while you're raising taxes and so on, you see this all the time. They'll introduce a tax levy, and then they'll say these industries are exempted for something, or the GST is not applied to what, fresh fruit? At some point, you might say, well, we're going to broaden the base of the GST, and we'll raise it, but we won't raise it on this particular area here. And you say, oh, well, now we've got inefficiency, so we make it more efficient and therefore raise it. So we have to be very careful that we're not actually endorsing this sort of ratcheting tax increases. Now, if we're going to raise taxes, it should be done by making the tax system more efficient. But I don't know it's something we want to endorse specifically. I do not. No, 0% income tax is the only one I would accept.
Freedom fighter.
I think one of the points that I make, and it feels to me like a weak justification. So I'm very conscious of that. But I look at you look at a government which has electoral incentives that drive it to spend money, and you look at a government at the moment which is in deficit. You look at the work out of Grattan showing that it's a structural deficit and has been for many years. And the kind of tack that I sort of look at this is it better for us to close off some tax expenditures or raise the headline tax levels? And
why don't we do both?
And I think
did she just advocate raising taxes?
I feel that it may not have been entirely serious.
2 out of 4 libertarians support raising taxes. You heard it here first, folks.
Yeah. I think that there's an argument there that it's better for us to focus on closing tax expenditures and offer up a solution, I suppose, to the budget deficit than it is for us to sort of blindly oppose any and all increases to tax on anyone.
I think the narrative that we approach it with is the important thing here. We're not attacking the tax system because it's inefficient. We're attacking it because it's too high. And yes, we should be making it more efficient, but that should not be the primary thrust of our argument. It should be we want to reduce the tax burden in total. And one way of doing that is by getting rid of tax expenditures and streamlining the tax system. But it's just the means to the end of lowering taxes overall. We have to stick to that narrative.
Okay. Now, while we're all here, this week, I think, is the 10-year anniversary of the first same-sex marriages being performed in California, which is really interesting. Pardon?
I say, well, and of course, the issue was settled then and forever. It sounds strange to think that there was a time when gay people couldn't get married.
California, of course, being the arbiter of international law, which is why there are so many protests happening in Sochi right now. And it's a question that is quite complex from a libertarian perspective, the reform of marriage and same-sex marriage. I know libertarians we don't have to be, but a lot of libertarians, at least in my circle, are creatures of the right. And are more aptly described as conservative libertarians or small government conservatives. And so for them, there is kind of they have an interest in keeping marriage as a religious term and not permitting same-sex marriage or significant changes to the institution of marriage. But looking at it from the question of whether or not the government should get involved, a tack that a lot of us take is to promote the privatization of marriage. That is, marriage that isn't regulated by the state, which sounds horrifying if you're, well, the first time you hear it, it might do. But really is very, very logical. Up until, I think it was the 1950s, there was actually no government regulation of marriage in Australia. And everything was fine. You know, the world did not end. The skies were not red with blood. The oceans continued to wave.
You have evidence of
that? The reason, as I understand it, that the state actually got involved in marriage was to allow people of different religions to get married, because, of course, their churches have very strict rules about who they will or will not marry and what they accept as a marriage, and they wouldn't you'd have problems where Protestants and Catholics wanted to get married and so on and so forth. And so that, as I understand it, was the purpose of government regulation. It was actually to make marriage more accessible. And now we're in a weird position where we're having a fight about making marriage more accessible again, but apparently with much more vitriol than we did 60 years ago. So I like privatization as an alternative. I think it's certainly the ideal that we should be striving for. It's not a particularly controversial libertarian position. However, one thing that I find really interesting is, particularly in an Australian context, I don't know that we actually do need no, wait, no, that's same-sex marriage, not privatised marriage. In Australian context, how would you implement it? That's the big question for me, because it's not simply a matter of repealing the Marriage Act or passing a law that says we will no longer define what a marriage is. That marriage isn't just about, the wedding or signing your contract. It affects your tax position. It affects your bank account. It affects things like your next of kin. So as a legal institution, it's been built into all of these other legal institutions, and it's kind of intractable. What do you guys think?
I think so for a moment we convert Australia into Libertopia, and
Capistan.
Has been, and Capistan, Terra and Capistanis. Marriage has been privatized, and now you try and fly or move over to New Zealand, and they know you don't have a marriage that's recognized by them. So marriage is tied into a lot of international treaties and cross-recognition. So there's some pieces there where you have your private marriage in Australia, which is not registered with anyone, and that's great. And then you travel overseas and they say, well, I'm sorry, you're not married. Your wife's been in a car accident. They'll say your wife, in inverted commas, has been in a car accident, and because you're not married, you're not her next of kin, and can't make decisions in this situation. There's an international aspect as well to marriage.
So then what about the gay marriages that have been allowed in Scotland? What happens to them coming here?
Their marriage is not recognised. So there's some specific stuff where as soon as you enter Australia, that marriage is not recognised. So I know of some people even that have been married or a civil partnership, I think, in the British consulate in Sydney, and then they are a recognised partnership for the time that they spend in the consulate, and then they step out and they are no longer recognised.
This criminal government, what a confusing system. I wonder if you couldn't possibly solve a lot of those problems by going the other way entirely and refusing to define what kind of relationships can be privileged in marriage.
Yeah. My kind of
anyway, that doesn't solve that problem, but it's an interesting idea.
Well, my sort of thinking is that we should move towards a complete separation of the civil or the government aspect of marriage and the religious or the personal aspect.
Oh, that doesn't actually exist in our country.
So what I'm saying is that that's what we should move towards. So
But that separation already exists.
So to completely separate that.
Oh, okay.
So what we should move towards is, if you want to get a wedding, you can go to any church or whoever you want.
Whoever wants you.
And whoever wants you. And if you can find someone who will officiate, or maybe you don't even get officiate, you can just wake up, roll over in the morning and say, let's have a wedding, I'll make you breakfast in bed. Go nuts, whatever you want.
I was this bacon and egg muffin, hereby declare my love for person X.
Yeah, I think Kieran's kind of outlining how he intends to get married.
But I think, and that I would say is that what the terminology we use for this can vary, but that your personal or your religious decision is entirely between you and your friends, your family, your chosen religion. That's for you to sort out. You can go and get your wedding on. If you want to go and have the government recognition, and to their credit, the Rudd Gillard government removed and equalised a lot of the differences between de facto and marriage and same-sex de facto and heterosexual de facto arrangements. And I think if you want the government recognition, you show up and you get your marriage certificate. And if you want to only do one, only do one. And the Australian system at the moment isn't entirely dissimilar to that, that you can, as a straight person, go and have, I think you have to go down to like the registrar or a magistrate.
Yeah, but I think the issue is with gay people.
Yeah, but I don't, the argument that you see from conservatives that if you allow government...
We're not going to Cory Bernardi this up.
No, we're not. We're going to avoid arguments from Cory Bernardi.
No, I will Cory Bernardi the shit out of this. There's a slippery slope, and it's a good thing.
Yeah.
For bestiality, but can't consent.
Well, here's the thing.
Understand what that statement was about.
To the extent we still must have government marriage, and I agree that it's probably not going to be gotten rid of anytime soon. We want to make it as inclusive as possible. And in fact, I think it should be as simple as you go down to the courthouse, you have a form with a list of names. If you need to add additional names to your marriage, you can attach additional forms. And you just write down your names, everyone signs up, and then you're legally married for all the purposes that it matters. And it needs to be something that someone can unilaterally withdraw from as well. That if I'm part of a few marriages and I want to withdraw from one, I don't need the permission of everyone else I'm married to get out of that particular marriage relationship. And I think that's probably the most simple way to do it. And then you can have the civil marriage, do whatever you want. And we can use a different word so we don't upset the people. We can call it just, I don't know, like contractual domestic partnership or something. I don't know.
That sounds too complex.
The Austen Agreement.
Yeah, exactly. And ideally, well, we could work up to a stage where we have one communal polyamorous relationship across all of Australia for all legal purposes. I think that's really the end goal. Marrying everyone to everyone, mandatorily.
There are so many things I don't want to do there.
So I have no problem with polygamous marriage arrangements, whatever people want to call it, as long as all the parties involved are consenting, and I don't see a reason government shouldn't recognise that. And I think that Lara's right. If there's a
I actually think it's because we're being invaded by Muslims, Kieran. And if we let them practice their culture, then pretty soon
it is.
The culture we practice. Just for people who are listening in, that was sarcasm.
I think people can consent to, the foundation for me of sort of a libertarian view of the world is that people are, with very few exceptions to do with intellectual disabilities, they're endowed with the ability to think about things and make their own decisions and consent to things.
Would you say they're endowed with free will?
Free will and sovereignty over themselves.
Yeah.
You can choose to get married. You can choose not to get married. You can choose to marry Austen. You can choose not to. You can choose to marry 10 people, 15 people, one person.
Yeah.
As
Maybe
long
we
as
should all get married and have a special wedding episode.
Yeah.
They're fantastic.
Does that give you all U.S. citizenship then?
I really hope so.
I hope so. Does it come with a gun?
Well, in our civil domestic partnership, I'm sure there would be an entire cache under the house with a couple of tanks, courtesy of...
I thought we were calling it the Austen Agreement. So
it comes with these guns.
For anyone listening, Austen just
Austen is
flexed.
taking us to the gun show.
No, but yeah, I mean, I can understand where Austin's coming from. Yeah, essentially, like, getting married should be as easy as opening up a bank account.
Yeah. Or so getting married should be as easy as moving in. Like
Actually, yes.
that's
Yeah. This is something you and I have a major agreement on because moving in with a partner is actually a major thing in your life. But we just blink, and like it's not at all regarded as a point of importance. But marriage, which is just essentially signing a contract.
Well, you can see like Vikas and Kieran, life partners, just moved in together today.
yeah. We are looking for polygamous additions to our relationship under an Austen agreement. But yeah, like absolutely, like the decision to become de facto and to have almost all, like 99% of the legal responsibilities of being married is something you don't need to tell the government about. You don't need to tell your family about.
Yeah, I mean, who goes like, yeah, you and I want to be together. Like, let's go tell Tony Abbott about it.
Yeah, you might.
Very important that Tony Abbott is supportive of my relationships.
Yeah, you might tell your friends because you need them to help lift a couch, but the decision is fundamentally between yourself and your partner.
Exactly.
And I think that getting a government-recognized marriage should be as simple as that. And for that matter, the divorce end of it should be as simple.
No, okay, so I think I deviate from you slightly on this. I actually believe like a marriage contract should actually explicitly state what happens if the contract is terminated, and that is all that happens when you terminate, when you end your marriage.
I think there's some interesting separate issues there, but the point I was going to make is just if Vikas and I became life partners and we moved in together.
Wait, hang on. We weren't already? What's going on?
Yeah, it's awkward. It was going to come out at this juncture, but
oh my god, it looks like
this. Coming out the right word.
Yeah. If Vikas and I were life partners and we moved in together, and then it fell apart, we would move out, and it would be as simple as that.
Yeah, pretty much.
And to pick up on what Austin was saying earlier, it's unilateral.
Yeah.
Like, if
you don't need my approval.
If I've decided to break up with Vikas, and he tries to keep me in
really
the house,
right now.
he's kidnapping me.
So, and I think again, it's important to note that this only applies to the government marriage. That civil marriages can have all sorts of bells and whistles attached, and make it more complicated to separate. If you want to have that in a divorce, you split your property 50-50, fine. But we're just talking about the government marriage certificate, and I think that should be as minimalistic as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think on the contract side of things, I think that it can be useful to think of marriage and divorce as a contractual issue. And a lot of libertarians make the mistake that you can put anything in a contract, and well, we agreed in a contract 20 years ago, therefore this flies. And
that's not actually true for very many reasons.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you go off and you do contract law, they'll say, yeah, these terms may be struck down by the court for being unfair, unenforceable. Those issues, I think, still apply in the marriage scenario.
And there's also duress and all sorts of other stuff.
Absolutely. And if I somehow fool Vikas into marrying me or coerce him into agreeing to
this fairy tale's taking a nightmarish turn.
Yeah.
Boy, I'm glad you did not sign that, Austen.
Yeah. So if I've somehow coerced or tricked Vikas into agreeing to some things, he shouldn't be bound by them. That's contract law.
Yeah.
And the same deal applies in a marriage. And to that end, I think ideas that people might want to agree to having a no-fault divorce.
I used to be for that until I understood what it was, and then I'm just like, whoa, that's actually terrible.
Yeah, I would not agree to a marriage which had no fault divorce.
Yeah, so
allowed.
Despite the name being no fault divorce, it does not mean, right? It does not mean that that like no one's to blame. It actually means that you need a reason to get out. So yeah.
But my understanding is that the only reason that is accepted in Australia is 12 months of separation or more.
12 months, 1 month, and 1 day.
Yeah. Yeah.
That seems, to be honest, that strikes me as pretty reasonable. It really does. But I'd be interested in hearing what your objections to it are.
Okay. Can I?
Yeah.
Okay. So I know a lot of people that have actually gone through this, and it's actually quite painful when the marriage has completely ended. That this person, like, you know, like the two people have to, like, firstly they have to separate, and then on top of that they have to maintain everything, all the costs and everything, for a year, a month, and a day before they're granted their divorce.
Yes, like if I split up and then I just max out my credit card on a joint bank account every day, every month, every opportunity I can for that 12-month separation, that can be a real problem for the other partner.
Exactly. And not just that, but it's also, it complicates divorce proceedings, especially when it comes to having kids, quite drastically, in a sense, like, it turns everything into a piss fight about who gets more time with the kids in that separation period, because, you know, that's what factors into the calculation for, you know, who gets to keep custody of the kids and how much custody they're entitled to. So
I don't think that removing no-fault divorce would address that, though. I mean, my understanding is in the US,
it actually,
where you have fault, if it's still a drawn-out and painful process, perhaps not in exactly the same way, but as you were saying before, you have the ability to challenge the terms of a marriage contract. So even though you might have agreed that in the case of me cheating on my partner gets the kids and the property, and I'm out on my butt,
not actually the case in Australia.
You wind up back in, a protracted legal battle.
Yeah, I think the reality of relationships ending, particularly long-term relationships where you had intermingled finance and or children in there, is that it's always going to be a complex and drawn-out process of separation. Like, it's the incredibly rare and lucky people for whom that goes smoothly. There's going to be arguments and tears and lawyers and all of that along the way. I don't think that there's any benefit to adding in the sort of 1 year, 1 month, 1 day burden on top of that. If for some reason you're lucky enough, you're unlucky enough to be in a marriage you want out of, but you're lucky enough that you both want out and it's amicable and it's easy, why wait? What benefit is there from waiting 6 months, 12 months longer?
I usually equate it to ripping a Band-Aid off, right? You know it's going to hurt, so do it quicker. Essentially, but like, and it's to be perfectly honest, like the system is put into place with this very, very 1950s idea that, like, they're just having a fight and, just give them time and they'll get back together again.
Yeah.
And really, I mean, I'd like to see statistics where that's actually the case. I very much doubt it. I very much doubt that's the case.
Well, that's the paternalism inherent in government, I guess. Well, that has been, I think that's probably a good place for us to wrap it up. We've said a lot of words, had a lot of thoughts, had a lot of good times, may have accidentally entered into an Austen partnership. And it's been a very exciting and educational time for all of us. So thank you to everyone listening. We have been taking a number of liberties, and it's been glorious.
Catch you next week.
Look forward to you next time.
Bye.
Laters.